Welcome, seekers of the hidden and the profound. Today we're diving into a common strategy used in a presuppositional apologetics, and we'll explore the role of transcendental arguments. The goal is simple: to better understand how to engage with presuppositionalists in debates or discussions, no matter the topic. Presuppositionalists typically begin by shifting the burden of proof onto their opponents. It doesn't matter what the claim is, even something unrelated to God. They'll immediately zoom out to philosophical fundamentals, demanding a justification that starts from core abstract principles and ends with the claim in question. In effect, they're asking, really insisting, that their opponents lay out their entire worldview and show how the claim fits within it. That's an unreasonable demand in any debate. Most people aren't prepared to reconstruct their philosophical foundations on the spot, and many have never even encountered these kinds of questions before. What matters in a debate is that claims are defended using widely accepted standards of good reasoning. Things like classical logic, basic arithmetic and chronology, standards of evidence, and rules of inference in inductive reasoning, such as appropriate sample sizes, and also in abductive reasoning, we should look at the breadth of an explanation, its predictive power, and its ability to uncover things we didn't previously notice. So if someone can apply these tools effectively, the deeper philosophical justifications for using them aren't necessary in that moment. It's unreasonable to expect every debater to be well-versed in the philosophy of statistics, probability, mathematics, logic, or in the philosophy of general science. And these reasoning tools have a long track record in guiding us toward truth. So rather than demanding an opponent to justify his entire worldview, including the foundations of these tools, it's more productive to use the tools themselves to identify and explain flaws in the reasoning being presented. But this isn't just an unreasonable demand. It's one presuppositionalists rarely meet themselves. They almost never present a detailed case showing how their own worldview accounts for or explains the issue being discussed. Instead, they often assume, intentionally or not, that if their opponent fails to ground a claim within a fully developed worldview, then theirs must be the correct one by default, along with everything it entails. It works like a disjunctive syllogism. Either A is the correct worldview or B is. B is not the correct worldview, therefore A is the correct one. But there's a problem with this kind of reasoning. First, it just assumes that one of the two has to be true. Then it takes the opponent's failure to defend their worldview, B, as proof that A must be right. But what about A itself? Like I said, they never actually show that A is true. It could be that both A and B are false. The correct move would be to build a case for A, show that it follows from using solid reasoning principles, and then if B can be ruled out, A becomes the reasonable conclusion, not just by default, but because it actually holds up. That way, we're not just playing with logical forms, we're applying them to something real. Now, maybe you've seen a presuppositionalist actually walk through their whole worldview and show how it supports everything they're claiming. But in my experience, I see a lot of demands and not much delivery. This strategy applies over a type of reasoning known as transcendental arguments. And these arguments are typically used to counter extreme hyper-skeptical positions, claims that, when analyzed closely, rely on assumptions they themselves undermine. These are often referred to as preconditions of intelligibility, the necessary foundations that make meaningful thought and communication possible. Take, for example, a hyper-skeptic who completely denies the reliability of our senses. To make that claim, he would have to identify certain experiences as deceptive, implying others were reliable enough to serve as a contrast. In other words, his argument undercuts itself. A transcendental response might look like this. If you're claiming that our senses are completely unreliable, then you must have had at least some reliable sensory experience to make that judgment. But you're claiming that no sensory experiences are reliable. Therefore, your original claim can't be true. This kind of reasoning is essentially a modus tollens argument. But how does it fit into the broader strategy we've been discussing? In most cases, these debates center around the existence of God. Presuppositionalists argue that God, specifically the Christian God, the Trinity, is the fundamental precondition for intelligibility. They claim that any worldview lacking the Trinity will eventually reveal internal contradictions or an inability to account for basic principles. So, as we've seen, they begin with a disjunctive premise, either worldview A, theirs, is true, or worldview B, yours, is true. They then challenge their opponent, worldview B, to justify his claim and the philosophical foundations behind it, often diving into areas like the philosophy of logic and epistemology. But most people aren't prepared for this level of abstraction on the spot, and whatever response is offered, the presuppositionalist typically finds flaws. And that's not hard to do because, as we've said, most people haven't built their worldview from the ground up. During this process, they often introduce transcendental reasoning with lines like, "But to make that claim, you're using the laws of logic, which your worldview can't justify. Therefore, your claim is false." This use of transcendental reasoning is what they believe justifies the second premise, not B, or your worldview is not the case. And from there, they wrongly infer A, their worldview, as being the case, true. But again, in doing this, they fail to make a positive argument. In this case, a positive transcendental argument. Ideally, they should present a case showing that their worldview passes a transcendental test. That means taking something we typically take for granted in debate, like logical or mathematical axioms, or the general reliability of reasoning, and demonstrating that the Christian God, specifically the Trinity, is not only necessary for these things to be possible, but is the only explanation that adequately supports them. It might look something like this. If the basic axioms of arithmetic are intelligible, then the Trinity must be their necessary precondition. We know these axioms are correct, and here is where they would have to explain how the Trinity undergirds these axioms. And 3, therefore, the Trinity must be the case. Now, how many times have presuppositionalists actually done this in debates? That is, laid out their worldview and show how it satisfies a transcendental test? None that I've seen. So how does all this play out in real conversations with presuppositionalists? Their core strategy is to shift the burden of proof onto their opponents, as we've seen, while using valid forms of reasoning to make their arguments sound more persuasive. And this creates an air of plausibility, especially for those who already lean into their direction. And most people have only a vague or partial understanding of what good reasoning looks like, so the presuppositionalist's approach can seem far more convincing than it really is. And how should we respond to this? First, we should question the relevance of the demand being made. If everyone in the discussion already accepts the basic canons of truth-conducive reasoning and their reliability, then there's no need to dive into abstract philosophical foundations. And second, if those foundations do become relevant, we should remind presuppositionalists that they too have a burden of proof. It's not enough to critique someone else's worldview. They must also demonstrate that their own worldview is the correct one in the disjunctive syllogism. And that means showing how it holds up under a transcendental test by connecting their most fundamental precondition of intelligibility, the Trinity, through some reasoning to things like logic, arithmetic, universal grammar, or the general reliability of thought. And in doing this, you're pushing them to present a complete case, not just to cast doubt on your position, but to positively demonstrate that theirs is true. That is what would make their arguments not only valid in form, but sound in content. It would also show that they're willing to meet the same standards of argumentation they demand from others. And that's it for this one. It is a shorter video, but I hope it is a useful one, especially for those of you who enjoy debates in philosophy and theology. So, thanks for watching, and when the bell tolls, I'll see you again.